The man responsible for my parents' death stood up at my sister's wedding and made a toast about what a terrible and mentally disturbed sister I was. And he was smiling when he did it. 200 people laughed. The jazz band played something soft in the background. Champagne glasses caught the chandelier light. And Henry Colton, one of the wealthiest men in Colorado, stood at the head of that ballroom and said, to Paige, may she finally have a stable family. Something her sister could never give her. That was it. That was the moment 20 years of patience stopped feeling like patience and started feeling like a countdown reaching zero. My name is Vivian Cooper. Viv, to the people I trust. And by the time that toast was over, Henry Colton was about to find out exactly what it costs to humiliate the one person who has been quietly, methodically, patiently building the case that buries you. But let me take you back, because this story doesn't start in a ballroom. It starts in the dark, at the edge of a chain-link fence, with sirens and the smell of coal dust, and two parents who never came home. I was 17 years old the night the Colton mine collapsed. It was winter. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill you, it gets into your bones and stays there. I remember standing behind the fence they put up to keep families back, my fingers wrapped around the metal links, watching the emergency lights cut through the dark. Ambulances. Shouting. The sound of equipment moving fast. Someone near me said the roof gave in. Someone else said the beams weren't reinforced properly. And I remember thinking, my parents are in there. My mom and my dad, who'd both worked that mine for years, who packed lunches and came home smelling like earth and metal, who put Paige to bed every night and called me their little engineer because I was always drawing buildings and bridges in my notebooks. They were in there. And by morning, they weren't coming out. The headline the next day said, Natural quake causes tragic accident. I was 17, but I wasn't stupid. I knew what a quake felt like. I grew up in those mountains. And what happened that night didn't feel like the earth moving on its own. It felt like something gave way that was never built to hold. So I walked into the Colton mining office 2 days later. Still in the same coat I'd worn to the fence. I don't even know what I expected, some kind of answer, maybe. Some kind of acknowledgement that 2 people had died and someone should at least look me in the eye. The man behind the desk didn't look up from his paperwork. He said, you should move on, kid. Colton paid the settlement. There's nothing else here for you. And that's when I saw it. A report sitting on the edge of his desk, partially covered by a folder. I don't know why I grabbed it. Maybe because I had nothing left to lose. I pulled it toward me and scanned the page fast, the way you do when you know someone's about to stop you. One line. One line burned through everything else on that page. Approved for cost reduction. W. Colton. I folded it. I put it in my coat pocket. And I walked out. That was the day I stopped believing in accidents. The years after that were hard in a way that's difficult to explain if you haven't lived it. I was 17 with a 7-year-old sister, no parents, a small settlement that wouldn't last forever, and a head full of rage I had nowhere to put. So I put it into work. I finished school. Got a scholarship for civil engineering because, honestly, it was the only thing I was ever good at, looking at how things were built and understanding immediately what would make them fail. I worked construction jobs on weekends to pay for the apartment Paige and I shared. A 2-bedroom place with thin walls and a radiator that clinked all night, but it was ours. Paige grew up drawing pictures at the kitchen table while I studied. She had this imagination that just wouldn't quit, always sketching these elaborate fantasy worlds in the margins of her notebooks. I fed her sandwiches more nights than I want to admit. I missed her school play once because I had a double shift. I carried that guilt for years. But I also carried that folded report in my wallet. Worn thin at the edges, the ink fading, but still readable. Approved for cost reduction. W. Colton. I built bridges by day. I raised Paige by night. And I waited. Not passively, I want to make that clear. I wasn't just sitting around being angry. I was learning. Learning how mining structures work, how safety regulations are enforced, how financial fraud is traced. I spent evenings cross-referencing public records, old news stories, anything I could find about the Colton mine collapse. I reached out to an investigative journalist named Russell about 4 years in, a quiet, careful man who'd been looking at Colton mining from a different angle, following a trail of money that didn't add up in the company's environmental compliance fund. We compared notes. We were patient. And then one evening, my phone lit up with a text from Paige. Viv, Jason proposed. You're going to love his family. I stared at that message for a long time. My hand tightened around the phone until my palm hurt. Jason Colton, Henry's son. Paige, my little sister, the girl I raised on sandwiches and borrowed dreams, was engaged to the son of the man who killed our parents. She didn't know. Of course she didn't know. I'd protected her from all of it deliberately. She was 7 when it happened. She grew up knowing our parents died in a mining accident, but not the why, not the documents, not the one line on that report. I thought I was protecting her. I thought I was giving her a clean life. Now I understood that clean life had just walked her straight into the lion's den. I met Henry Colton for the first time at a dinner at the family estate about 3 months before the wedding. All glass walls and vineyard views, the kind of house that's designed to make you feel small the moment you walk in. The air smelled like expensive candles and something slightly sterile underneath, like a showroom pretending to be a home. Henry sat at the head of the table like he always sat at the head of everything. He had this way of looking at you, slow, assessing, like he was already calculating how much trouble you might be and whether you were worth managing. A civil engineer, he said, swirling his wine. So you build things that eventually collapse. It wasn't a question. It was a test. I met his eyes. Only when someone removes the supports. His smile froze. Just for a second. Then it came back, thinner. We both knew what I meant. Behind him, on the wall, there was a large framed family portrait. Henry, his wife, Jason, and behind them, visible through the window in the photo, the exact mountain ridge where the mine had collapsed. He'd put it there on purpose. I was certain of it. A quiet declaration. I won. This is my house. This is my legacy. Dinner was polite and sharp at the same time, the way conversations are when everyone's saying one thing and meaning another. When it ended, I stepped outside into the cold. Jason followed me, hands buried in his coat pockets. He's hard to deal with, Jason said quietly. But he's not all bad. I looked at him, this genuinely kind-seeming young man who was in love with my sister and had no idea what was underneath the foundation of everything he'd grown up on. You've never seen the beams from the inside, I said. I left him standing there in the snow and drove home. That night, I opened my laptop and kept digging. And that's when I found the Castle Creek extension files. A new construction site. A new set of blueprints. Load-bearing structures compromised. Reinforcement skipped. Supervisor sign-off. W. Colton. He was doing it again. I forwarded everything to Russell. His reply came back within the hour. If this checks out, it's homicide. 2 weeks before the wedding, everything started moving faster. Paige called me in tears one afternoon. Jason had heard rumors that a reporter was asking questions about his father's company. She wanted to know if I had anything to do with it. You're trying to ruin him, she said. You're trying to destroy Jason's family before we even start ours. I'm not ruining anyone, I told her. I'm rebuilding what they broke. She hung up. That silence between us, that dial tone, felt like something cracking that I wasn't sure I could fix. Hours later, Russell sent another email. He'd followed the money further. $3.2 million had disappeared from an environmental compliance fund and moved through a chain of accounts into an offshore Cayman Islands account. That fund had been created specifically in response to the mine collapse. It was supposed to go towards safety improvements and victim support. $3.2 million. That was what our parents' lives were worth to him. Less than the cost of one of the cars in his driveway. They died for $3 million, I whispered to the photo on my desk. Mom and Dad, smiling, squinting a little in the sun. A normal Sunday somewhere. Nothing special. Just them being alive. That night, someone slipped an envelope under my apartment door. Inside was a map of the Castle Creek extension site with certain zones marked in red. And at the bottom, in handwriting I didn't recognize, he's doing it again. Workers don't know. I didn't sleep. I found Paige the next day, trying on centerpiece options for the reception. She looked beautiful and nervous, the way she always looked when she was trying to hold too many things together at once. Henry was paying for their honeymoon, she told me. A full 2 weeks in the Maldives. Then he's buying your silence, I said. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. The light from the glass door fractured across her face as she turned and walked away. I went home and spread everything across my desk: blueprints, bank records, schedules, photos, a web of lines connecting names and dates and accounts. Every piece fit. 20 years of evidence, and it all pointed the same direction. A week later, Paige stood in her wedding gown for the first fitting, twirling in front of the mirror, and Jason stood in the doorway telling her she looked perfect. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The SEC had confirmed they were opening an investigation. Right on schedule. That evening, Jason came to my door alone. "If you know something about my father," he said, "tell me." I looked at him for a long moment. "Would you still marry someone whose family profits from the dead?" He didn't answer. He stood there in the hallway for a while, then left without another word. But something had shifted in his eyes. Something that looked like a door opening that he wasn't ready to walk through yet. The next morning, I learned something that made my stomach drop. Russell called to tell me that Henry had been laundering money through accounts tied to Paige's name, using her, without her knowledge, as a financial shield. She wasn't just marrying into the family. Her name was already being used to protect his crimes. I sat with that for a long time. I wrote in my journal, "If I stop now, he wins. If I continue, she suffers." Justice always breaks something. But I also knew, the longer I waited, the more deeply Paige's name would be embedded in those transactions. The window wasn't closing. It was already almost shut. I texted Russell, "Wedding day. 2:15. When he makes the toast." 3 days before the wedding, I drove out to the old Colton mine. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I needed to remind myself what this was really about. Because somewhere in all the documents and strategy and moving pieces, it was easy to lose sight of the fact that this was a real place where real people had gone to work one morning and never came home. The air out there was damp and sharp, the smell of rust and old earth. The walls of the mine entrance were cracked, metal beams eaten through by time. Nobody had maintained it. Nobody had memorialized it. It had just been left there to quietly fall apart, the way Henry preferred all uncomfortable truths to be handled. I ran my fingers along the stone near the entrance. There was an old engraving, nearly worn away, "Safety first." I almost laughed. "You forgot your own words, Henry," I said to nobody. I stood there for a while in the cold, just listening. Wind. Birds somewhere far off. The sound of the mountains just existing, indifferent to all the human mess at their feet. Then I got back in my car and drove home to finish the work. My desk looked like a war room by that point. Blueprints overlaid with financial records. A printed timeline of every documented decision that led to the collapse. Witness statements I'd collected over years, quietly, carefully, from former Colton mining employees who'd since moved on and were willing to talk as long as their names were protected. Russell's face appeared on my laptop screen for a final check. "Are you sure about the timing?" "He'll raise his glass at 2:15, I said. "Make sure everything is ready. The files go live the moment the toast starts. And if something leaks early, then we move it to 1:45. Only you and I know the updated schedule." That same night, an anonymous email went to Henry's inbox. Just 5 words, "The SEC knows. Check servers." Within the hour, his office was in full panic mode. He ordered a complete systems audit, combing through old servers trying to find the leak. Including, I heard later, the server I'd briefly had access to through my engineering consulting work years ago. He found nothing. Because there was nothing to find there. I'd erased every trace of my access years in advance. The evidence wasn't on any server he controlled. It was somewhere no one could delete it, staged on international servers through Russell's network, ready to go live on command. He spent the night chasing shadows. I spent it writing. On the last page of my notebook, I drew a rough diagram, not a blueprint this time, but a map of everything that was about to fall. Every connected point. Every crack in the foundation. And at the bottom, I wrote, "Collapse imminent." That night, there was a soft knock at my door. Paige. She was in her silk robe, her hair loose, her face pale. She looked like she hadn't slept either. "I can't sleep," she said. "Jason's scared." "I'm scared." "Viv, please just tell me this is all going to be okay." I looked at my little sister, this person I had spent 20 years trying to protect and provide for, who had no idea she was standing in the middle of everything I'd built toward, and I told her the truth. "Tomorrow isn't about hate," I said. "It's about truth. But truth hurts people. So does every reconstruction. She stood there for a long moment. Her lip trembled. Then she turned and walked back down the hall, pulling the door closed behind her. And we both knew, without saying it, that something between us was about to change permanently. Whether for better or worse, that was still up to the morning. Across the hall, in his suite, Henry was on the phone. I couldn't hear the words clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. Hard, controlled, a man who still believed he was managing the situation. Someone apparently suggested canceling the ceremony. His answer was no. "Tomorrow I'll make my toast," he said, "and remind them who owns the ground they stand on." He wired money that night to silence a journalist who had gotten too close. He didn't know the files were already out of reach. He didn't know there was nothing left to silence. Around midnight, Jason knocked on my door. He had a folder in his hand. He'd found it in his father's study, documents with forged signatures on financial authorization forms. His signature. Paige's signature. Both used without their knowledge to authorize illegal offshore transfers. He stood in my doorway, looking at the papers like they were something he couldn't put down but couldn't keep holding either. "He used me," Jason said. "He used her." "Yes," I said. "You were right." "I know." He looked up. "What do I do?" "Tomorrow," I told him, "stay quiet. Let the ground collapse." After he left, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time. I barely recognized myself, pale, eyes hollow from months of running on too little sleep and too much adrenaline, hair falling across my face. I looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. I was 17 when the ground fell the first time, I said quietly to my reflection. "Tomorrow, I'm making sure it's the last time it ever does." I went to bed. Before dawn, there was a folded note under my door. Paige's handwriting. "Whatever happens tomorrow, please don't forget I love you." I didn't cry. I folded the note carefully and put it in my coat pocket, right next to the worn, faded copy of the report I'd carried for 20 years. Approved for cost reduction. W. Colton. One pocket held the reason. The other held the love. Both were going into that ballroom with me. The morning of the wedding, the snow had stopped. Sunlight came over the mountains clean and sharp, the kind of light that makes everything look freshly made. I sat at my kitchen table with a single glass of red wine in front of me, untouched. I picked it up, barely off the table, and whispered, "For you, Mom. For you, Dad. For truth." Then I set it down and got dressed. The ballroom in Telluride was exactly what you'd expect from a Colton event. White and marble and glass, everything gleaming, the kind of room that costs so much to rent it feels like a statement. Guests drifted in wearing things that probably cost more than my car. Violins. Soft laughter. Cameras flashing at Paige, who was breathtaking in her gown, genuinely, heartbreakingly beautiful. I took my seat at the far end of the room and I waited. I watched Henry work the room, handshakes, back pats, that easy laugh he had, the one he'd probably practiced in mirrors. He was in his element. Comfortable, powerful, untouchable. This was his world and everyone in it moved according to his gravity. Paige caught my eye across the room once. Her expression was complicated, worried, loving, afraid. I held her gaze for just a second and gave her the smallest nod. I didn't know if she understood it. I hoped she did. At 1:45, not 2:15, because Russell had moved the schedule after the early leak scare, Henry Colton picked up his wine glass, straightened his tie, and turned to face the room. The talking quieted. The violins faded. "To Paige and Jason," he said, his voice filling the space the way it always did, confident, warm on the surface, commanding underneath. "May your marriage stand stronger than some foundations we've seen before." A ripple of laughter. A few glasses raised. I stood up. The room noticed. Not all at once, but table by table, heads turned. My silver dress caught the light as I rose, and I kept my voice calm, clear, and steady. "You talk about foundations, Mr. Colton." He turned. His smirk was already in place, the one he'd used on me at dinner. The look that said, "Here we go, the difficult sister." "But do you actually know what keeps the ground stable?" "Ah," he said, the smirk holding. "An engineer's lesson. How fitting." I set my glass down on the table, hard enough that the sound carried. "You built your empire on hollow ground," I said. And I'm here today to make sure it collapses. For a half second, the room was completely still. Then his phone buzzed. He looked down at it, and the color left his face. Behind him, the large decorative screen that had been cycling through wedding photos flickered. The photos disappeared. In their place, headlines began loading, from the Telluride Watch, from the SEC's public filings page, from two national news outlets that had been holding the story under embargo until this exact moment. Colton Mining under federal investigation. SEC confirms multiple accounts, financial fraud, safety violations, offshore transfers. Documents link Colton approvals to 2004 mine collapse. Investigators confirm families were never notified of safety cuts. The room erupted. Not in applause, in chaos. Guests standing, voices rising, cameras swinging toward the screen and then back toward Henry, who had gone completely still, his wine glass still in his hand, the red swirling inside it. Jason was on his feet. You used my name for this? His voice cracked. You used Paige's name? Henry said nothing. For maybe the first time in his life, Henry Colton had nothing to say. Paige was crying. She had both hands over her mouth, and she was looking at Henry the way you look at something when you realize it was never what you thought it was. I walked toward the center of the room. Cameras followed me, though I wasn't thinking about cameras. My parents worked in your mine, I said, and my voice was steady because I had been waiting 20 years to say this out loud, in public, with proof. They went to work one morning and the roof came down because you signed off on cutting the reinforcement beams to save money. You paid a settlement. You called it an earthquake. You buried it and built on top of it, and then you stood at this table and laughed at me for not giving my sister a stable family. I let that sit for a moment. My parents died because you chose profit over safety. Today, truth weighs more than your gold. I turned to Paige. Walk away, I said softly. Take Jason's hand and walk away. She looked at me for a long moment. Tears on her face, mascara tracking down her cheeks, her bouquet hanging loose in her hand. Then she reached out and took Jason's hand. And they walked out of the ballroom. The room fell apart behind them. Henry slumped back against the table. His wine glass tipped. Red spread slowly across the white linen like something finally coming undone. I walked past him toward the exit. The cameras clicked. By morning, that image, Henry Colton, hunched over a wine-stained table, the headlines blazing on the screen behind him, would be on the front page of every major newspaper in Colorado. That night, back in my apartment, the rain was coming down in thin lines against the window. I had the TV on low. I wasn't really watching it until I heard the name. Henry Colton has been detained by federal authorities following the release of incriminating documents. The SEC and FBI have confirmed multiple accounts are under investigation, including evidence of financial fraud, deliberate safety violations, and the misappropriation of over $3 million in victim support funds. I turned it off. The room was quiet. Just the rain and the hum of the city outside and my father's old drafting pencil sitting on the table in front of me, its metal edges worn smooth from years of being handled and carried and held. They finally saw what you saw, Dad, I whispered. The front door flew open maybe an hour later. Paige. Eyes swollen. Still in her wedding dress, though the veil was gone. She stood in my doorway, shaking, and the first thing she said was, "You destroyed my husband's family. You humiliated us in front of everyone." "No, Paige," I said. "I stopped pretending your happiness wasn't built on lies." She threw a newspaper onto the table. Someone had already printed the story, or maybe it was from a news app, I wasn't sure. Henry's face stared up at us. Handcuffs. The headlines I'd spent 20 years building toward. "You could have told me," she said. Her voice broke on the last word. "Would you have listened?" That stopped her. She stood there, and I could see her going back through her memory, sorting through everything she knew and everything she'd missed, rebuilding the story with this new information laid over the top of it. "I didn't know," she said finally, quieter. "I didn't know who he was." "I know you didn't. That's why I waited. I needed it to be undeniable before I showed you." She looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time since this whole thing had started to unravel, she wasn't looking at me like I was the enemy. She was looking at me like she used to look at me when she was 7 years old and scared and needed to know things were going to be okay. We didn't hug. We didn't make up in some neat, tidy way. Love and grief don't work like that. They wrestle, and neither one fully wins. We just stood there in my small apartment with the rain coming down outside and the evidence of 20 years on my desk, and we let it be complicated, because it was. My phone rang. Russell. It's done, he said. The Cooper Memorial Fund is reinstated. The assets Henry misappropriated from the original Victim Support Fund have been traced and earmarked for redistribution. The company will be restructured under new management and renamed Cooper Memorial Fund in honor of the original victims. I sat down. I hadn't realized how long I'd been standing. Then the ground finally holds, I said. Later that night, a message blinked on my screen. It was from Paige. I finally understand. You didn't destroy us. You rebuilt us. Thank you for giving me something solid to stand on. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I smiled. Small, quiet. The first real one since the mine collapsed. A year later, the old Colton mine site had been transformed. Wild grass had grown up through what used to be rubble. The cracked walls and rusted beams were gone, cleared away and replaced with a small, clean memorial space, a marble monument, engraved with the names of every person who had died in that collapse. Including my parents. Sarah Cooper, Chris Cooper. Cooper Memorial Trust, built from truth. I knelt in front of it and laid down a bundle of white lilies. The wind was soft. The air smelled like new earth and something green, the smell of things growing back after being broken. I pulled my father's drafting pencil from my coat pocket, the same one I'd carried for years, the same one I'd left by Paige's bed the morning of the wedding with the engraving facing up, built to last. I turned it in my fingers once, then pressed the tip gently against the base of the monument and etched a small line just below the engraving. A single mark. Not visible to anyone else. Just mine. Russell walked up behind me, his footsteps slow on the new grass. Do you regret any of it? He asked. I kept looking at the stone. No. You can't rebuild without breaking first. He held out an envelope. Paige wanted you to have this. I opened it. Her handwriting, steady now, sure, not the trembling script of the night. She slid a note under my door. We're expecting. If it's a girl, I'm naming her Violet. After you. I want her to know what a true foundation means. My eyes stung. I let them. I folded the letter carefully and held it for a moment before putting it in my pocket. Then the name will stand strong, I whispered. I stood up and walked away from the monument, back through the grass toward the open hillside. Behind me, the stone caught the morning light, the names carved into it clear and permanent and finally visible after 20 years of being buried. The sunrise came gold over the mountains. The last of the winter snow was melting, water running clean through the soil, cutting new paths down through the rock. The world called what I did revenge. I called it restoration. Thanks for listening. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to comment and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to let the truth stay buried. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet, patient work of someone who simply refused to forget.